All right, let's talk about it. Joining us, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, MS Now senior investigative reporter Carol Leonnig, New York Times reporter who covers the Justice Department Glenn Thrush, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree, and the president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Erin Haynes. She's also an MS Now political contributor. Lots to talk about, lots of great voices. Lisa, what is the law here?
Where we're talking about, I assume you're asking me the law under which we understand that Don Lemon is going to be charged today?
Exactly.
Okay. We understand from the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of Justice itself, that Don Lemon will be charged with 2 counts. One has to do with a conspiracy against civil rights, where you are charged with intimidating, interfering with, impeding anybody's exercise of their civil rights, constitutional or statutory, but is a conspiracy against rights. And one of the things the federal government will have to show is that there is an agreement among those who are participants in the alleged conspiracy to violate the civil rights of another. This is a statute, Katie, that has its foundations in the Ku Klux Klan Act of before the turn of the 1900s, a very, very old statute traditionally used to vindicate the rights of African Americans and other disfavored groups in this country. The second statute that they're using is the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, that was passed in 1994, originally with the goal of ensuring that people had access to abortion and reproductive health clinics, preventing people from blockading themselves in front of it. It requires a use of force, a threatened use of force, or some form of physical obstruction in order to make out the elements of this crime. One of the things that I and others, including Carol, have noticed this morning is that when you look at the video footage of Don Lemon at that church, it's unclear to us what force Don Lemon is alleged to have used or even threatened to use in the exercise of his First Amendment rights while he is there documenting the protest. We aren't seeing him blocking, for example, an entrance or exit to the church. We aren't seeing him physically obstructing anyone. We do see him rather close in proximity physically to the pastor, for example, who we see questioning him, questioning right there. But there's nothing that indicates, either visually or in the affidavit that the Department of Justice filed last week when they first tried to charge Mr. Lemon, that he actually used or threatened force or obstructed somebody. At the most, that document says that a number of unknown individuals whose names are redacted cornered parishioners during the course of that protest.
Okay, so let's talk about how this came to be. Glenn, it is notable that this was announced on social media by the Attorney General. Tell me why it's notable that she was the one to put this out there.
This has been her cause celeb. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, is not very well regarded inside the White House. She is widely perceived as having screwed up the rollout of the Epstein files. Remember, she was the one who said that she had them all on her desk. And then sometime over the summer, she said that they were going to close the investigation, which caused this massive backlash. So she is doing everything that she can and has to perform for the White House and President Trump in order to keep her job. Generally speaking, she does not really control the day-to-day the operations of the department. Todd Blanche, who had his press conference today, is the one who handles that. So she has seized upon this issue, this church protest, as a way to politically counter-program all these calls for a federal investigation into the death of the 2 protesters. So let's just put this right out there. This is a politically motivated effort on the part of the Justice Department. That is not something that I am asserting. This is something that their behavior has demonstrated. And one other thing I want to add to this. We are seeing one of the real unique features of the Trump Justice Department. We should call it the Trump Justice Department because he controls it, is that they celebrate these incremental procedural, judicial, and law enforcement benchmarks, the issuance of subpoenas, perp walks, arrests, these things that have visual signifiers, these things that are almost in the form of tweets or press releases. The question then becomes, do they have the evidence to obtain an indictment or way up the road a conviction? Thus far, this seems to be following the pattern of so many other things, including the Comey and James prosecutions. They get a big bump up front. They get to take credit. Everyone goes on Twitter and celebrates it. But the cases tend to be much weaker when they are put before a judge.
All right, so put a pin on that for a second, because we want to talk about the goal. If the goal is not, if the goal is not to actually get a conviction, because that is going to be difficult. Maybe they acknowledge that, maybe they don't. What could the other secondary goal be? Hold on that for a second. Carol, let's talk about the the evidence here and the difficulty in securing a conviction, even bringing this to court. Again, why was Pam Bondi announcing this? Why were we not hearing from career prosecutors who might be overseeing this case?
Yeah, great point to flame onto right there, Katie, and also really good summary by Glenn about what we've seen in terms of the pattern and practice of Trump's Justice Department, the sort of exciting perp walks and the tangible, tweetable goals here. But here's what's a red flag for me. This morning, as soon as we were learning that Lemon was arrested, thanks to Lisa, especially in her reporting, as soon as that happened, we were hearing from sources saying that career prosecutors in Minnesota who have been really devastated and turning away from many of the cases that they're being pushed to prosecute involving detaining immigrants or even in the church protests, that those Minnesota prosecutors and LA prosecutors in the career bench were resisting having any involvement in this case.
They make a point of saying on page 2 that it was so scary that young children were left to wonder, as one child put it, if their parents were going to die.
Where to begin? I mean, we're covering an administration, as you and your guests have shown today, that is looking the other way when children and others are scared of the actual federal agents using deadly force against Americans, killing an unarmed mother of 3. There is a traditional deference in the legal system in courts for the government's argument. This administration is burning that up. And that's not my observation. That's what we're hearing on this very case. I just want to remind everyone, as we go through these claims, some of which don't appear on first read as very factual, that this effort to indict a journalist for this was rejected internally by the guardrails inside the DOJ, even with people willing to carry out Trump's agenda in general, and by judges. And we've touched on this in our coverage today, but I want to reiterate it. We're not looking at anything that started out in a normal, factual, legal way. As far back as January 22nd, a judge already rejected the low standard of probable cause to bring a case against the longtime journalist, now independent journalist, Mr. Lemon. The following day, the Trump forces tried to appeal that, find a different judge to see if they would override that. They're allowed to do that. They lost again. The appeals judge did not find that this met the fairly low standard of probable cause. To remind everyone, at the beginning, you only need probable cause. That's very low. Later, you need to prove it before a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. So starting at the lowest, easiest burden, they couldn't meet it. We also have reporting from MS Now journalists that there were people inside the DOJ that refused to bring this case. Again, they've supported everything Donald Trump's DOJ has been doing up to this couple weeks, but wouldn't bring this case. Why? Because it's not a matter of opinion, because they didn't think it met the legal standard and they have an oath. So that's the wider context. The other thing I would read here with regard to the overt acts is on page 8, they say that Lemon was involved in, and you alluded to a different passage that mentions this, quote, oppressing, threatening, intimidating the church, congress, and pastors, physically occupying most of the main aisles, rows, and chairs, etc. Anyone who's ever watched coverage of protests, which we've had on our air and other journalists doing that this month, or past demonstrations in the United States and elsewhere, knows that journalists move around in areas where other people may be trespassing, may be violating a curfew, etc. This is standard. So again, I always want to be fair about what we're looking at, but I also need to be honest. Nothing about this effort to bring in a journalist into an area where other citizens, people may have been trespassing or violating rules, passes the test.
So Ari, if they're going after Don Lemon in this way, and if this is not an indictment that on first read is going to make it very far through the system, to do that and to do it to Don Lemon, who is one of the most recognizable faces and figures in this country, somebody who has had a very public and contentious relationship with Donald Trump now for 10 years. What is the intention behind this? What message are they trying to send?
Well, I think it's a great question, Katie, and I think when we actually look at what's happening here, this was admitted as coming from the top. We had the unusual presence of the Attorney General saying this was on her orders. That makes it harder to win the case in the long run, but she may have her own reasons for telegraphing that. We had Donald Trump also calling out and attacking Don Lemon. I want to be clear, the president, like everyone else, is free to express his views, and he can be very strong and critical of all journalists, all of us, all people. That's First Amendment. the First Amendment also protects the right of the press to report. So it goes both ways. What we are witnessing is an administration that wants free speech and free press for them, what they like, and not for everyone else. That's a bad sign. The amendment is first precisely because the founders were worried that autocrats and despots would try to do this. So the messaging to your question is maybe they want to make a point. Maybe they want to use legal harassment. Maybe, and I'm not reporting this as fact, but this is a question we would put to the administration. They can speak to it. Maybe they are trying to pick on individuals who aren't a part of large corporations right now and don't have a standing, funded legal defense long term.
Made a big mistake and handed Don Lemon a massive victory in court, both on the legal side, right? A lot of experts are saying this case has no real merit, but also on the political side, on the optics side, because let's keep this in mind. This is going to make Don Lemon a bigger deal than he's ever been, right? And I'm not suggesting he's happy he got arrested. Of course he isn't. But he is going to be made a much bigger name because of this. Remember Jimmy Kimmel? Jimmy Kimmel thanked Donald Trump for increasing his ratings after he tried to take him off the air. And of course that isn't Jimmy Kimmel saying, yes, Mr. President, please encroach on my First Amendment rights. He's not saying that. But what he is saying is, you're going to create a massive Streisand effect, right? Remember the whole thing, the Barbra Streisand thing back in, I think, the 90s? And paparazzi were taking pictures of her house, and she didn't like that, and she was getting really mad, and she was threatening people with lawsuits or whatnot. And then everyone was like, man, I gotta see this house. And it's like, if she would have just let it go, people wouldn't have cared, but then it became this big deal, and out of interest and principle, it became a big story, right? And that's what's gonna happen here. But also, just like with the Comey case and with like the Letitia James case, it's very clear Trump's just going at his enemies and it's going to backfire, right? What did it do? No one was talking about James Comey, and a lot of people had differing views on James Comey. And with James Comey, a lot of people in my audience, and I understand why, are like, I'm not a fan of the guy because he dropped that letter about Hillary like 2-3 days before the election, very inappropriately giving an FBI policy, right? You're not supposed to drop things like that right in an election period. But on the other hand, he's a victim of Trump imperialist totalitarian actions. And so I have to critically support him. And he won by uniting anti-Trump people around him and by the facts of the case being terrible. So Don Lemon will win here. He's going to win almost certainly in court. That's I'm not a lawyer, but that's just my guess. And he's already won the battle of public opinion.